Hi, I'm Nathan, and you're listening to the Queer Conscious Podcast. Have you ever just sat on the couch, turned on Netflix, and just scrolled for 45 minutes trying to find something to watch? The decision fatigue is real. And in today's modern world of dating, it seems like there are so many options out there. You've got monogamy, you've got thruples, polyquads, open relationships. The list goes on, and it can be overwhelming knowing where to start. But today, I sit down with one of the most prominent voices in polyamory, Janet W. Hardy, who is the co-author of The Ethical Slut, which has helped millions of people rethink love and relationships. Janet has a gift for simplifying polyamory and inspiring us to view love not as a limited resource, but as something that can be expansive, abundant, and deeply transformative. Now, in this conversation, we don't just stop at relationships. We also dive into the beautiful spiritual experiences she's had through kink exploration, which she highlights even more in her book, Notes of an Aging Pervert. So whether you're polyamorous, a serial monogamist, or a closeted perv, this episode will leave you thinking about connection in ways you never have before. So open your mind, open your ears, and maybe even your relationship. Let's get into it. Hi, Janet. Thank you for joining us today.
Hey, Nathan. How you doing?
Good. How about yourself?
Oh, getting by. I'm taking off for Atlanta in a day or two and giving a talk in Atlanta Saturday night, I think.
Oh, that's awesome. And what's the talk about?
This one is it's a new one. It's called Everything I Needed to Know I Learned in the Dungeon. And it's basically stories of weird scenes I've been involved in and what I learned from them.
My gosh.
It may eventually turn into a book, but for now it's just a talk.
Awesome. Well, hopefully we can learn some of those things today. I brought you on here. One, I just have loved your books and what you've brought to the queer community and beyond, just embracing relationships. And you've been such a prominent voice there. And I'm curious, just to start us off, how would you define an ethical slut?
I would say an ethical slut is anyone who believes that sex and relationships can be a healthy and fun and growth encouraging thing to have, regardless of whether they're conventional or not.
Yeah, see, and now that doesn't seem so scary. That's
it
great.
Does not. In fact, I think a lot of people would believe that, although some people are really still hung up on the monogamy thing, which, okay, whatever.
Yeah.
If I don't argue with people for whom things are working. I
No.
would not be able to live the life I do if I insisted on arguing with people who arrange their relationships in ways I think are dumb. So,
well, see, I appreciate you have an acceptance of their relationships and what works for them. And I wish more people had an acceptance of, ethical non-monogamy, right?
Well, yes, from a wanting the greatest good for the most people point of view, yeah, I wish that people would lose their hang-ups about all kinds of consensual relationship formations.
Yeah, absolutely. Keyword consensual.
Consensual, yes. And kind, I guess. Relationships that are good for everyone in them and that the people who are in them make a point of making sure are good for all the people in them.
Oh, I love that. That's like so tender too. And I think people don't often see the tenderness in ethical non-monogamy.
Well, I think a lot of people sort of envision what they would like to have if they didn't have monogamous commitments, which, it's usually a lot of very outrageous orgiastic behavior.
Yeah, maybe they're projecting their own fantasies there.
No shit, Sherlock. Yeah, that happens a lot, in the BDSM community as well. I've talked to many, many vanilla people who have these horrific pictures about what happens in a dungeon that, it's their shadow self imagining the worst possible stuff. And when they see actual play, it's really, for the most part, pretty, I won't say gentle because it isn't. It's loving is what it is. And that's a thing that doesn't come into the picture in their mental picture. And the same with ethical non-monogamy. They imagine, the worst kind of slut, the indiscriminate and uncaring kind of relationships. And that's not what I see when I look around.
No. And I mean, what progress have you seen in being able to see ethical non-monogamy and polyamory as valid relationship styles?
Oh, it's changed tremendously. The first edition of the Ethical Slut came out in 1997. So we probably started writing it in 95, so almost 30 years ago now. And for one thing, back then, anytime I told someone about this book I was working on, I had to explain what polyamory meant. People didn't, the term was coined, as far as we can tell, in the early 90s, but it hadn't gotten much traction beyond, the usual suspects of alternate reality communities, Ren Fair, science fiction. That's where a lot of polyamory found its start. And so you could say polyamory maybe at a science fiction con and people would know what you meant. But if you were telling it to your next door neighbor, they probably wouldn't. Now, I can't remember when the last time I had to explain the word polyamory to anybody.
Yeah.
I mean, it was on the cover of Newsweek at one point back in probably about a decade back. And there was a television show and, and there's been a lot more talk about it since then.
Yeah. And would you say that ethical non-monogamy falls under the umbrella of polyamory, or do they deserve their own separate categories?
Actually, we prefer polyamory as the, we being my co-author, Dossie and me, we prefer polyamory as the umbrella term for all forms of consensual non-monogamy. For the very simple reason that we don't like defining ourselves by what we're not. And when we say we're non-monogamous, in a way that's conceding the game before we even got the ball on the field. Yeah. So that's why we coined the term ethical sluthood, which, by the way, was a joke between the two of us until it wasn't, until we realized we didn't know what else to call our book. Is we want to be celebrated for what we do, not for what we don't do.
Yeah, I love that. And I think we can all really want that in some way, shape, or form to be celebrated for what we do.
Yeah. And that, people these days seem to be saying ethical non-monogamy or consensual non-monogamy. And besides being a whole mouthful of syllables, it's also, it's conceding the field, that monogamists get to name what they are as the normative thing, and everybody else has to define themselves as not being that. And that's just wrong. That's not the way we want to do this.
No. And so how would you define polyamory?
I would define it as openness to sex or romance or relationship with more than one person with everybody's full consent. And note that I say openness. I don't say currently doing. I am, polyamorous to the bone, but I have not had sex with anyone, nor with anyone outside my primary relationship for nearly 2 decades now. But should it happen, if I wake up tomorrow morning with a wild hair and I want to go out and find myself a new squeeze, that's part of our agreements. Yeah. I wrote a little bit recently about a few weeks ago, my spouse had his ex up visiting. And this was an ex that it was a very passionate relationship at the time. It ended very badly, and they've been spending the last 20 years finding their way back to what they liked about each other. As it happened, I was going to be out of the house for most of that. And it was hard. I really had to just sort of recognize all the possible eventualities, which range from the two of them getting into a screaming fight the minute I'm out the front door, to them falling back in love and him being part of our relationship. Now, I suppose also possible that my spouse could leave me for them, but he's not an idiot. He wouldn't do that. I'm a much better deal. So I didn't really worry about that too much. But could I have this person as part of my polycule? Yeah, I could. I like what I know of him. I don't know him well. And I get on with most people. So
yeah, and I imagine that takes a lot of confidence and self-assurance within yourself to be able to manage the emotions.
Yeah. And it takes a certain awareness that I think a lot of people, when their partner is lusting after or loving someone who isn't them, they're going to imagine the worst. They're going to imagine that this person is better than them in every possible way. And I've been at this long enough that I just know that's not true. I mean, most people are not better than me in every possible way. Most people are okay. They're better than me at some things and worse than me at other things. And it could be that one of those things they're better at than me. For example, this ex loves to do outdoors things. He likes to hike. He likes to picnic. I don't like doing those things. The outdoors is what I have to walk through to get from the house to the car. So if there's a person in his life that he can do that with, that's great. I love having that option.
What is it like to be able to celebrate your partner when they get to do the things that they enjoy
With
and
someone
you
who
don't
isn't
have to be that? Yeah.
Well, back at the Carista commune, which was an experimental, quite large polyamorous communal group in San Francisco from, I believe, the late 70s through the early 90s, pretty close to that anyway. They coined the term compersion, which is a word for the joy you feel in seeing your partner having pleasure with someone who isn't you. And I often hear compersion defined as the opposite of jealousy, and it's not. I mean, it's entirely possible to feel both compersion and jealousy at the same time. But what it is a different framework to look at the feelings that you have about your partner being with someone who isn't you. And some of it is going to be hard and some of it is going to be lovely. And it's nice to be aware of both options or both extremes, since a lot of the things that happen are between those two.
Yeah, wow. I love that. Yeah. And I always thought compersion and jealousy were opposites too, but I think it is important to recognize that both may happen and that's okay. Yeah.
Yeah, my co-author Dossie read a book. There's a new book out about compersion, and she's loving it. She's raving about it. And it offers the idea, the sort of manifesto, that if we were all good at compersion, we would all take pleasure in each other's successes, not just our relationship partners, but all the people around us. And I love that. I think that is something to practice on. And polyamory is one of the ways to practice that.
Yeah, it's such an abundant mindset. And it's
Yes.
like we can all win in this, right? There's no scarcity here of love or connection.
Yes, exactly. So
I love that.
And that's one of the things that has to happen for those of us who grew up in a monogamy normative culture, which most of us, let's face it, did. I'm meeting some young people now who grew up around polyamory, and God love them, they're going to go places I can't imagine. But for most of us, we have to unlearn those scarcities, which we may have learned, when we were little and there wasn't enough of attention, there wasn't enough of love. Kids are little sinkholes of need, and there's never going to be enough. And so we all have those feelings of insufficiency. But when we go into alternative relationships, we have to look at new ways of looking at that. That if we feel deprived of something where we are in our lives, we can go find someone who offers us that something, and expand our connections outward. The first personal ad I put up when my partner and I moved from the Bay Area to Eugene, Oregon, where we live now, was not for a lover, not for a fuck buddy, not for any of that. It was for someone to go to the theater with, because my partner has a bad spine and sitting that long is very painful for him. And I love to go to the theater. It's an important thing in my life. So, I had someone to do that with in the Bay Area. And when I moved up here, I didn't have someone to do that with. So that was what I needed, because that was a big part of my life that wasn't getting filled.
That's so simple, yet so beautiful and profound to have that companionship and to be able to do the thing that you enjoy. So,
well, one of the best things Dossie and I like about the Ethical Slut is the idea that learning to value each relationship for what's valuable in it, instead of comparing them to one another. Those of us, again, who grew up in a monogamy and hierarchy mindset, it's easy to fall into the trap of this person is better than that person. I love this person more than that person. No, you love everyone differently.
Yeah, which is so easy for our brains to do that. But I think once
really
you do go on this journey and you think mentally and emotionally, you're growing in different ways that you probably didn't imagine.
Yeah.
What growth have you seen in people who really embrace this practice?
Well, one thing that's changed a lot is just the demographics. Because back when we first started talking about this back in the 90s, our audience was, as I say, you could shorthand it to geek culture, Ren Fair, neo-paganism, science fiction, Society for Creative. That was where we found our people. These days, when I go to talk about polyamory in front of an audience, it's everybody. Entirely mixed ages, races, classes, which is lovely to see, young urban professionals as interested in this as Ren Fair geeks used to be. So that's been a huge change, and that's partly a matter of visibility. And I believe it's also the greater culture coming to terms, consciously or with the fact that we were sold a big lie when we were told that the nuclear family was normal, much less sustainable. It's not sustainable. Certainly not unless you're wealthy. I watch my young friends who are trying to have 2 careers and kids and a house and some sort of social life, and it can't be done. It can't. There is not enough hours in the day to do that. I was just this morning read a statement by, may have been the Surgeon General, someone high up in government, saying that they were opening parental stress up as a topic of serious importance and something that needs attention paid. And yeah, the combination of this belief that the nuclear family is sustainable and post-capitalist cultures where almost nobody can afford a one income household anymore, it's making people miserable.
Yeah. And how does polyamory fit into this as an alternative to that?
Some of my first urges toward polyamory was during my first marriage, which was a monogamous one, but was also part of a large extended family, all of whom lived within 2 counties. And so, there were always people around to help. We used to vacation together. The family owns a big beach house in Santa Cruz. And so everybody would go, and there would be, grandmas and grandpas and uncles and aunts and cousins all around. And my kids were so much easier and so much happier there because they weren't looking to their dad and me for everything. If they needed their shoe tied, if they were bored and wanted to play a game, there was someone. And it didn't have to be me all the time. And it was awesome. And I think that's what a lot of us want. I just read a marvelous book called The Other Significant Others about people who have built their lives around friends, relatives, people who are not conventional romantic partners, but are dear. And they decide that they are life partners and they own property together. And if there are kids, they help raise each other's kids. And I think that's the way the culture is pushing because it has to.
Yeah.
We go on like this.
And that's beautiful. I really relate to that style of upbringing because I grew up with Mexican parents, both from huge Mexican families. So one weekend it's my dad's family, the next weekend it's my mom's family.
So that's what my first marriage was like as well. And it's wonderful. It really is.
Yeah, it's beautiful. And, I think as we've gotten older, we haven't been around as much with the family, but I noticed myself that loneliness seeping in and that support system isn't there. And so you really see this future of embracing polyamory as a way of helping to create that community structure for people. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So when a few years back, Dossie had major spinal surgery. They basically took her apart like a jigsaw puzzle and put her back together again. And it was a very long recovery period, during which time she was mostly helpless. And because she lives way up in the Marin Hills, that's hard to get to and hard to get around in, she spent a couple of months in the home of one of her exes, who has a nice big house in San Francisco, and being cared for 24/7 by her lovers and her ex-lovers and her lovers' lovers and her kid and her kids' lovers. There was this family of people that were dedicated to helping Dossie get back on her feet. And that's the future I would like to see. And I don't really care who's fucking who. I mean, to me, that's the least interesting part of polyamory. The most interesting part to me is, how do we learn to take care of each other outside this ridiculous artificial stricture that's been put on us.
Oh. And, I think people want long-term, stable, safe relationships. And then they resist this idea of polyamory because they see it as less stable, less secure.
Yeah.
So what would you say to someone who doesn't see them coexisting together?
The thing I like least about monogamy, and don't get me wrong, I think monogamy can work fine. I know a lot of very happy monogamous people. But what I don't like about it is its absolutism, where the only reason a marriage can end is because someone is terrible. And then there's a fight about which person is more terrible than the other person. And in fact, you and I both know relationships end for all sorts of reasons. And once you're over, usually there's some harsh stuff at the time of the breakup. I'm not sure that's avoidable in most cases. But once you're past that, then you get to remember all the things you liked about that person in the first place. And hey, presto, you've got this new friend or possibly another lover or, whatever. When my first marriage ended, which was basically because I wanted to be kinky and poly and he couldn't go there with me. I wonder often if a book like The Ethical Slut had been out, if we would still be together, but it wasn't. We aren't. But because I moved from Sacramento, where we had lived, to the Bay Area, and the kids were splitting time between our houses, we had joint physical and legal custody. So every Friday and Sunday, we would meet in the middle and usually have a meal. And sitting down as a family over a meal gave us a chance to remember what we had liked about each other in the first place, which was a lot. And we're still friends. I mean, he's remarried, I've remarried, but we still see each other when we can. And I like the guy very much. It would be realistic to say I love the guy very much.
And it strikes me that polyamory and ethical non-monogamy, at the root of it, it's really just embracing the complexity of relationships.
Yes.
And it holds space for all of the strengths and weaknesses and challenges within different relationships. And it just seems like a more realistic approach, again, versus that absolutism that you described.
During my previous relationship, there was a weekend where we were moving, and it was a multi-person household, and I was the only female-identified person in it. And I don't want to get too much into making wild gender generalizations here, but the fact is I was the only one doing most of the work. And I was so angry. I was so frustrated. I was so overwhelmed and exhausted. And finally, he just looked at me and said, "Why don't you go over to your girlfriend's house for a few days and come back when you feel better?" So I called her up, and she said, "Sure, come on over." And she put me in her front room, and I just sat on her couch, or more like actually laid on her couch. She had she had bought out all the Betamax tapes before the format went dead. So she had this immense library of beta. So I just watched movies and ate all her Halloween candy. And about 4 days of that was okay. And then I went home. And we didn't have sex while I was there. I was not in any shape to have sex with anyone, but it would have been okay if I had, because she was an established partner of mine. And I think the one I lived with was glad to be rid of me for a few days because I was not being easy to live with at that point. And so it was a safety valve. And that's part of it too. When there's problems in one relationship, having trusted people that can be a buffer, that's part of it too.
Yeah. And would you say that situation was resolved of you taking on the work? Because I think a lot of people think too.
No, I'm not with that guy anymore.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think I'm just like, there's this other critique I think I hear that people use open relationships as a way to just avoid dealing with the problems of their challenges. And I think that can be the case in some cases.
It's not usually a good idea. We advise strongly against people trying polyamory because something is broken in the primary relationship. No, you fix the relationship first before you add, it's like you've got a recipe that doesn't look good, and so you just throw things into it in the fond hope that it will someday be edible, and it very rarely becomes edible.
Yeah, no, and it's not edible. So then I also think there might be some ways that, ethical non-monogamy, polyamory can actually be a way to confront some of those challenges. Have you seen that in any of your experiences or people that you've worked with?
Here's a little one. An issue in my current relationship, which, we're coming up on our 20th anniversary, is the fact that I snore. He snores too, but I'm a heavy sleeper and he's a light one, so his snoring doesn't usually bother me, but mine often bothers him. And in trying to figure out how to solve this problem, which we did eventually wind up solving, I got to ask some of the other people with whom I shared my bed, do I really snore a lot? And one friend said, no, you have a cute little snore. So I knew I was not shaking the walls, and that there ought to be a workaround for small snores. I've been with people whose snores nobody could sneak. It would be like sharing a bed with a grizzly bear. You just could not sleep through those snores. But that's not what I have. So just having that outside reality check was very helpful. That's a tiny little thing, but it's an example.
But that is like, I think that can speak a lot to just not getting caught up in your own judgments and biases, and you get comfortable in that. And so again, having that external perspective, I imagine, really helps to ground yourself in the reality of the situation versus what you're experiencing.
Well, it's also very nice when you're having problems in a relationship to have people around you who are not going to say, well, what do you expect with that weird poly shit you like to do? Of course you're going to have problems. Having people who have done it too and can say, yeah, it can get tough at that point. And maybe, here's something else you could try. Or maybe just sit and listen to you when you unload, which is something we all need sometimes too. But, I've talked to so many polyamorous people who have had relationship problems and had no luck at all finding a sympathetic therapist. Because I think it's getting a little better, but for a long time, therapists were trained that infidelity, quote unquote, meant a major problem in the core relationship. And it doesn't have to. It often does not. And it's really rude to tell people that their desire or love or lust for another person is because their core relationship is broken, when in fact it isn't.
Yeah. And what might you say to polyamory people who are struggling or experiencing some of those challenges in the relationship?
They're lucky that it's 2024 because there are so many books out there now.
Yeah.
At the time that we wrote The Ethical Slut, actually, when we were researching the book, I went to a polyamory picnic in the Bay Area and introduced myself and said I was there because I was working on a book with my co-author. And during the break, one of the organizers came up to chat and said, why are you writing a polyamory book? Deborah Annapol already wrote the polyamory book. Now, for those of your readers or listeners of a certain age, that was Love Without Limits, and it came out in the early 90s. And that was apparently it. But what I told him was that Deborah wrote a great book about one kind of polyamory, which is the long-term multi-partner, probably living together relationship. And we want to celebrate all kinds of polyamory, up to and including, orgies and threesomes and all of the different ways people connect. And he said, oh, you mean tertiary relationships? At which point I nobly refrained from rolling my eyes and said, no, I mean like the guy on the other side of the glory hole. Got to watch his face all come apart. It was great. But recognizing all the ways that people connect and make each other happy. I mean, I forget
right there.
even what question
all the
I was
ways.
Yeah.
Oh, no, that's okay. But you ended on such a beautiful point. Again, just embracing all the ways that people connect and make each other happy. Like it's that simple. And I think that's what people forget when they see these relationships. So you've been doing this a couple decades now. And like, what led you to even wanting to share your story and to shine a light on just these practices?
Well, I used to be an advertising copywriter. I did that for the first 20 years of my adult life or thereabouts. And then I was working, I moved to the Bay Area to be with my now ex. And I was working for a Silicon Valley ad agency, writing copy for high-tech clients. And I'll make a long story short. It turned out that they were listening in on my personal phone calls, and they cobbled together a very Machiavellian way of and being able to fire me. And so I was out of a job in a town where I didn't know anybody. If I'd still been in Sacramento, I would have just picked up my freelance work again, but everybody was gone. And so at the time, my then partner, Jay, was working on the book SM-101, A Realistic Introduction. And I had done an article for a class that was about sexual domination for women. And here we were without an income source. And so we scrambled and got both books, his book SM-101 and my book, The Sexually Dominant Woman, into, not mimeograph, but Xerox form with, a comb binding, had them printed at the local copy shop, and started selling them at erotic boutiques around the Bay Area. And it all grew from there. So I think it's just in my nature to be a bit of an emotional exhibitionist. So when I write about this stuff, I write from my personal experience. And it grew from there.
Well, I think, your voice has been very prominent in helping to normalize polyamory, which is helpful for people to find a relationship style that works for them and not feel like they're an outcast or weird or broken in some way. So
I think part of what's so odd about this is that Dossie and I both learned most of what we know about polyamory from our gay men friends who are mostly not around anymore. And so there's a way in which we're carrying that torch because they're not here to do it. I think I may have mentioned before that a couple of years back, I was in San Francisco and standing in line at a coffee house. And it was a long line and I didn't have anything to read with me, so I was eavesdropping. And there were these two young gay men standing behind me. And one of them was talking about a first date he had been on the night before that was really hot, but he was upset because they had wound up making out. And he said, if he thinks I'm a slut, at which point I could not be quiet anymore. So I turned around and said, okay, number one, he was making out with you too. So if you're a slut, he's a slut and you're well matched. Number two, what has the world come to when a 60-something bi woman has to tell a 20-something gay man that it's okay to kiss on the first date? I mean,
oh my gosh.
I feel that the loss of that previous generation of men, plus the legalization of same-sex marriage, has brought mononormativity into the gay communities in ways that I wish were not the case. I mean, if people want to get monogamously married, blessings on them, but I don't want to lose that voice of other ways of relating.
And I never thought about that how the legalization of gay marriage might have impacted our ability to
big time.
really embrace our maybe more natural tendencies.
Yes.
So,
well, it's really the same issue that comes up around who gets to march in Pride. And, every town has its battles about, do we let the leather people march in Pride? Do we let the bi people march in Pride? Do we let the slutty people march in Pride?
Yes, the answer is yes.
Yes, we do, but it has not always been that way. My spouse actually was the co-chair of San Francisco Pride for a number of years, and he is bi and genderqueer and kinky. And so he had to really draw some harsh lines to make sure that his people got to march, got to be seen.
Wow. Well, that just sheds light on all the appreciation we really need to have for the generation, especially the men who are no longer here with us.
Absolutely.
Try not to forget that, as much as I did grow up with Glee and Lady Gaga. So, so Janet, you have a new book out called Notes of an Aging Pervert. Can I ask you a personal question?
Sure.
Are you a pervert?
I am. I'm an old pervert.
That's amazing.
Yes.
What is a pervert to you? What's your definition of that?
A person who can find sexual pleasure in things that most people would not find pleasurable.
Love that. And what would be the benefit of someone embracing their inner pervert?
There's so much to learn. My own practices have to do with ecstatic pain play, which in many ways resembles the explorations of earlier generations who journeyed on psychedelics, and that's coming around again now. But you can get to those places in all sorts of ways, including intense pain play. And so I have learned so much by giving and receiving that. Um, I try to imagine who I would be if I had not gotten there. And I would not be the voice that you recognize as someone who knows a lot about things.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you share a lot about the catharsis that you experience. And
Yes. Catharsis is
uh,
a big part of it. Ecstatic states are a big part of it.
yeah.
There's a wonderful book, fairly recent, called Hurt So Good. That's a woman's exploration. In each chapter, she goes out and explores a different source of consensual pain. She's already a ballet dancer and a sadomasochist, so she's pretty hip to a lot of it already. But she does the polar bear swimming. She does the hot pepper eating contests, all kinds of things. And she's really present in describing how each of those feels and why she wanted to do it and what she learned from it. Um, it's one of the best books I've read about that. So
Oh, that's beautiful. And so I guess for you, what's been some of the personal growth that you've experienced in those spaces?
I've come to understand, I'm not even going to say believe because I'm pretty sure of this, that bodies are what we have for being in space and time. And that when we're not in our body anymore, we're also not in space and time. So I'm pretty sure we're all out there. Everybody who's ever been alive is out there somewhere. But it's hard even to talk about because when I say out there, then there we are back in space. We don't have a vocabulary for talking for anything outside space and time because we're in a meat brain and it makes words for what it understands. But for in ecstatic experience, I've had milliseconds of not being caught in that anymore. And so I have an idea of what's in a bigger universe than me um, that I wouldn't have gotten otherwise.
Is that part of your own spiritual practice now?
It just helps me understand the world in a bigger sense. I was privileged to be part of my father's chosen death. He had cancer and he lives in Washington State, which has very liberal assisted suicide laws. And I don't know what that would have felt like to me if I didn't know what I know. Um, the night before, I was up there and we were eating dinner, and I asked him how he was doing. And he said he was okay, but he said he was scared. And that just broke my heart because I know he didn't have to be. But I also didn't think it was the time or place to try to instruct him in what I know about the universe. So I wish I could have made him less scared, but I didn't know how.
Yeah.
But then in the thing itself, my understandings were so amazing through a very strange set of circumstances. I write about this at some length in Notes of an Aging Pervert, but I had stopped to get the cannabis product that I use for my arthritis pain, and they had a different formulation than I was used to. And so, long story short, I don't do well with THC anymore, and this stuff had more of it than I was expecting. So by the time came, I was stoned. I don't much like to be stoned. But there I was, and there wasn't much I could do about it. That's one of the reasons I don't like to be stoned is there's no way back except waiting it out. But because I was stoned, I had visions. I could see his face changing from his face to the face of an ape to the face of a skull to the face of an angel, round and around and around while I was sitting there. And then suddenly I saw a little disturbance in the air over one shoulder, like the ripples over a hot highway. And that was how I knew he was gone. Um, and I mean, it might not have happened had I not been stoned, but it certainly wouldn't have happened had I not been someone open to recognizing what was going on. And I had a very weird podcast interview a while ago with a guy who said, okay, I read in your book that you're very conflict averse. And I said, yeah, I am. Dossie and I both are. And he said, and then I read that you're not afraid of death. And I said, yeah, that's true. And he said, so you're telling me you're more afraid of having a fight with your husband than you are of dying? I said, well, yeah, kind of. I'm scared of what comes before dying. I don't like the idea of pain or helplessness, but the actual dying process.
Yeah. But what is that comfort that you find in death?
I get to find out what's next.
Yeah. Yeah. That's beautiful.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
I mean, it's not next. Again, that's a time word. It's now,
Mhm.
but I get to be in it, whatever it is.
Yeah, you get to find out what's next.
You
And
have,
speaking of dying, there's also the concept that you talk about in the book called conscious dying. Is that
yes.
right? Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit about what that is?
I think again, this is a generational thing. A lot of folks who were around during the plague got to see this firsthand because many people chose to leave of their own volition before things got too bad. That was a little bit before I became involved in queer community. I was still being a wife and mom in Sacramento, so I had this by hearsay only. But a lot of my friends went to parties that were all about sending someone off. And at the peak of the party, the person would take whatever meds would do the job and go bye-bye. They showed on Grace and Frankie, there was an episode about a friend of theirs who had a big party to check out during. And having agency about your own death, it amazes me that so many people have a hard time with that idea. People who wouldn't think twice about taking their pet to the vet because it was suffering to have it put down think that it's wrong for humans to have that same privilege.
Yeah.
And even with Dad, the meds that they use for this are the same as the ones that get injected into a pet, but you have to take them orally, which means they take fucking forever. I mean, if I had not seen that ripple over his shoulder, it would have been really hard to watch because he was there for several hours after. And I read later in the literature that it could be up to 24 hours before the people check out altogether. And we were fortunate enough that one of his dear friends was an RN, so we didn't have to have a stranger in the room. And so she was there to check his pulse. But what we kept seeing was it would be very quiet for a long time. And she'd be getting up to go take his pulse, and then all of a sudden he'd have this big rattling Shane Stokes breath. We'd all sit down and wait another several minutes. And it was, if I hadn't known he was already gone, it would have been agonizing. I remember hearing someone comparing the death process to the birth process many years ago, but it stuck in my head. It was a friend who had helped her mother die. And that's all it is. It's just getting unborn. It's a way to a different plane of existence. And there again, we have space words, but it just is. It's
our only understanding of it, I guess, is trying to.
Yeah, it's the best we can do. I mean,
yeah,
I can't even conceive infinity. Nobody can.
Yeah.
The brain is not meant to conceive something like infinity. The best we can do is really, 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 really big, and that's a fraction of infinity. So, there are things that the meat is just not designed to do, and that's one of them.
Yeah, and it's just beautiful that you're able to really find this comfort and expansion in your own understanding just through some of these sexual practices and kink and altered states of consciousness. What else have you learned in that process?
Oh God, where am I? I'm working on this talk right now.
Yeah. Well, this is perfect. Some things you've learned in the dungeon, perhaps?
Yes, absolutely. Taking responsibility for your choices. That if you're part of putting together a scene, whichever end of it you're on, and it doesn't go the way you want, that's partly on you. And you have to own your participation if you're going to move on and learn anything from it. What else? I learned about being genderqueer during my play. It started when I was wailing on a friend of mine, and at some point he looked back over his shoulder and called me sir. It was like, oh, okay, I can do that. And then later, play partner of mine and I had several scenes in which I was topping him go south, go really pear-shaped, where someone was unhappy and it wasn't a good part of the scene. And I got to where I was scared to top him anymore. And he still wanted to play, and I had to figure my own way through that. And I thought, if I were a guy, I wouldn't be scared. And so that was Joseph. Um, and Joseph is a really mean fucker, I'll tell you. After the scene was over, we were lying there, sweating and panting and cuddling. He said, "I love you." I'm not too sure about Joseph.
Oh my
So
gosh.
that was, my explorations of my own gender started in the dungeon.
I think that choice is just this theme that's kind of moving out through today. It's right. The choice to have a relationship and to create a relationship container that works for you. Choice around death. And then choice around your gender expression. There's so much choice here that I'm seeing.
There's a rule in improv theater that's called yes and.
Mhm.
So someone lays a line on you, and what you don't do is say something that contradicts that line. You build on. And so yes and, beyond the stage, it's a really important skill for life. Someone else tells you a thing, and you think, okay, yes, I believe that that's what they experience, and this is what I experience, and what can we build from that? Yes, and is a really good way to move through life, I think.
Yeah, I agree. And then again, what you said before too around owning your choices.
Yeah.
You have to get really good at saying yes and no and being careful about what you say yes and no to. And when you can own your experience, I imagine that gives you maybe a sense of pride and accomplishment of
Absolutely.
creating a life that you want to live.
Well, one of the things we point out about blaming in the Ethical Slut is how profoundly disempowering it is to blame things on someone else, because you've just robbed yourself of any opportunity to change them. If it's that person's fault that things went wrong, then what can you do about it? How can you move on to the next better thing? Whereas if you recognize the role that you played, then you have a way to begin working on building something better. That's not to say that there aren't blameworthy people out there. We both know they are. But in the absence of genuine malfeasance, ignoring a safe word would be a good example of malfeasance in the BDSM community. When someone has unequivocally stated that they are no longer consenting and you go on, then that's blameworthy. That is a thing to blame on somebody. But for the most part, it's more like, wow, I thought I was going to like that and I didn't. And then you can either say, well, let's do it differently this time because I learned something new. Or you can say, you fucker, how could you do that to me? And the latter is not a good way to move through your life, nor is it a good way to get better at what you do.
No, it's not. And yeah, I agree with that. It is giving your power away in what you've chosen and almost disrespecting the choice that you just made and the person who wanted that, an hour before. Right. Yeah. Wow. But one of the other things I really wanted to ask you about is there was a quote I read in your book is, it may seem like a contradiction, but I learned from playing with strangers that love is essential to any kink scene. And I often don't associate love with kink or haven't. And I'm curious, how do you think love impacts kink?
I think if you don't have it in you to love the person you're playing with, you probably shouldn't do the scene. Unless you're a pro or something like that, and there's money instead. And, money is lovely, and maybe you love money. That's fine.
Yeah.
But what you're doing when you play for me, in the scenes I want to do, what I am doing is finding new, more intimate ways to connect with someone. And I don't want to peel off that skin and join in with somebody else if they're not a person that I could love.
Yeah.
And it doesn't necessarily have to mean any of the things that we tend to associate with love, like, ever seeing them again, for example, or
Yes.
or living together, or having kids together, or sharing a checkbook, or whatever. It's just, like they used to say back in the day, love the one you're with.
Yeah. Which I imagine that's where polyamory becomes very useful in the space like kink, when you can separate that and still embrace that area of love. And now I wonder how else we can embrace this idea of polyamory in other situations outside of kink, like the workplace.
Why, yes, there, it's a yes, and is the key to a lot of things. And seeing other people's success as making the world a better place, even if they're people with whom you have competitive feelings. I'm a very competitive person, but I do not want to be the kind of person that can't take joy in other people's successes.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that is beautiful. Janet, I just want to say thank you so much for joining us and having this conversation. It's been very enlightening and almost an affirmation too of some of the ways that I see the world and themes that this podcast is really based on. And so I appreciate really reinforcing that through these ideas of kink and polyamory.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a pleasure.
Well, thank you, Janet. Thank you for listening to the Queer Conscious Podcast, where we explore how love feeds us, heals us, and gives us life. I'm your host and queer love coach, Nathan Serrato. But remember that the conversations that we're having here today are not a replacement for working with a licensed therapist, professional coach, or mental health practitioner. These conversations are for entertainment and education purposes only. But if you are dealing with some big challenges and you're thinking about seeking some professional support, it is one of the most empowering things that you can do for yourself. You can visit queerconscious.com for more information on how to do that. Now, if you love today's episodes and you want more episodes like this, I need your help. Please leave a 5-star rating and review. That's going to help me to bring you more high-quality content and interviews. So until then, take care of yourself and don't forget to let love in.